Sad elderly billionaire alone on Christmas Eve, until a single dad and his daughter walk in. Eleanor Whitcomb had eaten Christmas Eve dinner alone for 6 years running, and this year, like the 5 before it, she told herself it wouldn't bother her the way it always ended up bothering her. She was 73, worth more money than she could ever meaningfully spend, the founder of a shipping and logistics empire she'd built from a single cargo route in her 30s into a company that now operated across 4 continents. She'd outlived a husband she'd loved fiercely, buried a son to a car accident 11 years ago, that she still, some nights, refused to let herself think about directly, and watched her remaining relationships, a niece, a nephew, a scattered handful of cousins, thin gradually into obligatory holiday cards, and the occasional strained phone call that always seemed to circle back. Eventually, to money. She'd stopped hosting family Christmases 4 years ago, after a dinner where her nephew had spent the entire meal steering conversation toward her estate planning, while her niece checked her phone under the table, both of them present in body and entirely absent in every way that mattered. Eleanor had decided, somewhere in the aftermath of that dinner, that she'd rather eat alone than eat surrounded by people counting what she'd leave behind, instead of asking how she was. So she came, every Christmas Eve, to Delacroix, the same small bistro on the corner of Ashford and 9th. Decorated every December with more warmth than her own enormous house ever managed, and she ordered the same meal, and she sat at the same window table, and she told herself, every year, that this was simply how her life had settled, and that settling wasn't the same thing as suffering. This year, sitting in her wheelchair at that same window table, watching snow collect on the sill outside, while her untouched plate steamed gently in front of her, she wasn't sure she believed herself anymore. Desmond Fairbanks hadn't planned on Delacroix at all. He'd meant to take his 8-year-old daughter Wren home after their annual Christmas Eve tradition of looking at the lights downtown. But Wren's stomach had started growling loud enough that ignoring it would have made him the villain of her entire holiday, and Delacroix had been the first warmly lit window they passed with an open sign, still glowing. He was 42, widowed for 3 years. Raising Wren alone in the particular quiet way single fathers learn to fill a house that used to have 2 voices in it. Christmas was hard in ways he tried not to let Wren see. His wife Carrie's had loved this holiday, with an intensity that made every December since her death feel like walking past a room he wasn't ready to enter, decorated exactly the way she would have decorated it. They were seated 2 tables from the window, and it was Wren small, unguarded, endlessly curious in the specific way only children manage on Christmas Eve, who noticed the elderly woman sitting alone first. "Dad," Wren whispered, tugging his sleeve. "That lady's all by herself, on Christmas." Desmond glanced over, and something in Eleanor Whitcomb's posture, the careful stillness of someone who had trained herself not to look lonely, even when there was no one left to perform composure, struck him with more force than he expected. "Some people are, sweetheart," he said quietly. "Doesn't always mean they want to be." Wren considered this with the grave seriousness she brought to most things. Then, before Desmond could stop her, slid out of her chair and walked directly over to Eleanor's table. "Excuse me," Wren said, entirely unbothered by the fact that she was addressing a total stranger. "Are you eating Christmas by yourself?" Eleanor blinked, startled out of a private, well-worn unhappiness by the directness only a child manages. "I suppose I am," she said carefully. "That's really sad," Wren said, with the blunt honesty of an 8-year-old who hadn't yet learned to soften true things. "Do you want to sit with me and my dad? We're right there," she pointed. Wren. Desmond had caught up to her. Mortified in the specific way parents are mortified by their children's unfiltered kindness in public. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. She doesn't usually—" "She's fine," Eleanor said, and found, to her own surprise, that her voice had gone slightly unsteady. That's a very kind thing to ask, sweetheart. I don't want to intrude on your evening." "You wouldn't be intruding," Wren said. "You'd be joining. That's different." Desmond looked at Eleanor, really looked, past the obvious wealth of her coat and the diamond at her throat, to the particular exhaustion behind her eyes, the kind he recognized because he'd been wearing a version of it himself for 3 years, and made a decision that surprised him as much as it surprised his daughter. "She's right," he said. "It is different. We'd be glad to have you join us if you'd like to." Eleanor hesitated for a long moment, old habits of polite refusal, warring with something else entirely, a loneliness so worn, in that she'd nearly stopped noticing its weight, until an 8-year-old in a green coat had named it out loud in 9 words. "I'd like that very much," she said finally. "Thank you." The staff helped move her table closer, and for the next 2 hours, Eleanor Whitcomb experienced something she hadn't experienced at a Christmas dinner in longer than she wanted to calculate. A conversation that had nothing to do with what she owned. Wren asked her 100 questions with the specific gravity children reserve for things that matter enormously to them. Did she have a dog? What was her favorite Christmas cookie? Had she ever seen snow this heavy before? And Eleanor answered every one, like it was the most important question she'd been asked all year. Because in the particular loneliness she'd been living inside, it might have been. Desmond, for his part, didn't pry into who she was or what she had. He asked instead about small, human things, what Christmas had looked like for her growing up, whether she'd always lived in this city, what she missed most about the version of the holiday she used to have. It took Eleanor nearly an hour to mention her late husband, longer still to mention her son, and when she finally did carefully, testing whether the grief would be met with discomfort or with room, Desmond simply said quietly, "I lost my wife 3 years ago. I understand more than you'd think. How a holiday can turn into something you have to survive instead of enjoy." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, something in her chest loosening that had been clenched tight for longer than 6 years. "Nobody said anything that honest to me at a holiday table in longer than I can remember," she admitted. They didn't exchange names beyond first ones that night. Desmond deliberately kept things simple, not wanting the evening to become about anything except what it plainly was. And Eleanor, unusually, didn't correct the omission or announce her last name the way she'd grown so used to doing, watching how quickly it changed the temperature of a room. For 2 hours, at a corner table in a small bistro, decorated with more warmth than her own house, she was simply Eleanor, an old woman who liked snow and missed her husband's terrible taste in Christmas music, sharing a meal with a tired, kind father and his relentlessly honest daughter. When the evening finally wound down and Desmond gathered Wren's coat, Eleanor found herself reluctant to let the moment end in the ordinary way moments like this usually ended: a polite goodbye, a returned nod, 2 lives brushing past each other and continuing on separately. "Would you," she said, careful not to sound as urgent as she felt, "consider having Christmas dinner with an old woman again sometime? Not out of obligation. I'd simply like the company if you're willing," Wren answered, before Desmond could. "Yes. Can we, Dad?" Desmond looked at his daughter's hopeful face, then at Eleanor's, and recognized in both of them the same quiet hunger for a table that didn't feel so empty. "We'd like that," he said. "Very much." What began as an exchanged phone number became, over the following months, something neither of them had expected walking into Delacroix that snowy evening. Eleanor started attending Wren's school recitals, sitting in the back row with a careful private pride that startled her every time it surfaced. Desmond began stopping by Eleanor's enormous, too-quiet house on Sunday afternoons, not out of any calculation about what she was worth, but because she made good tea and better company, and because somewhere in the last few months, her loneliness and his had started filling each other's gaps without either of them fully planning it. Eleanor's nephew, hearing secondhand about some man and his daughter spending time with his aunt, made exactly one phone call full of thinly veiled concern about her estate, that Eleanor ended within 90 seconds, with a clarity she hadn't summoned in years. "Desmond has never once asked me for anything," she told him, "which is more than I can say for you in the last decade." She didn't hear from her nephew again that year, and found, to her genuine surprise, that she didn't miss the silence he left behind. The following Christmas Eve, Eleanor didn't sit alone at Delacroix's window table. She sat between Desmond and Wren, the same table pushed together that Wren had insisted on a year earlier, and when the waiter, the same one from the year before, commented on how nice it was to see her with company this time. Eleanor found herself laughing, unguarded, in a way she hadn't laughed at a holiday table in longer than she wanted to admit. "Best Christmas of my life," Wren announced partway through dinner, with the sweeping confidence of an 8-year-old declaring something true, simply by saying it loudly enough. Second best of mine, Eleanor said, glancing at Desmond, thinking of a husband and a son she still carried quietly, every day, in the specific way grief settles into permanent residence rather than ever fully leaving. But close. Very close. Desmond reached over and squeezed her hand, not a romantic gesture, just a steady one. The kind exchanged between people who'd found, unexpectedly, a family in each other that none of them had been looking for in all of them. It turned out, had needed. Outside, snow fell steadily over Ashford and Ninth, the same as it had a year earlier, except this year, for the first time in longer than Eleanor Whitcomb could comfortably count. The window table wasn't set for one. The end.